Hi there, boys and girls. Welcome back to Haftarah Halfhour with me, Jason from Spiritualbabies.net, and with Rabbi Joshua Neely.
Hi.
We are back again this week. The Torah portion this week will be Noach, which means that the Haftarah portion will be Isaiah 54, 1 through 55, 5. So we're going to do the full length of the Haftarah portion this week. Just before we start, Rabbi Neely, what are the kind of overriding themes in Noach, and how are we going to see this played out in this week's Haftarah portion?
Well, Noach is a great parashah because everyone focuses on the major event, as it were, the story of the flood and the ark and the deliverance. But really, Noach is meant to be setting a much broader view of what the early human spiritual endeavors were like. And the theme of salvation and redemption and of rebuilding, and the overall promise that God is going to treat the world in a way that allows for growth rather than expecting perfection is one of the major takeaways from the entire Torah portion and from all of the events that happen within it. But sometimes that gets, if you pardon the pun, drowned out because of the amazing visuals that go along with the story of Noah itself. It captures the imagination so easily. It was made into a motion picture quite recently, and you don't get a lot of motion pictures about the other things that are happening in this Torah portion. But really the broader theme of redemption is going to play into the Haftarah very, very clearly.
So it's a very dramatic Torah portion this week.
Absolutely.
I would suggest to the viewers that you open up your Bibles right now, read through the Torah portion for Noach, and then read through this Haftarah portion too. So when we work through it, you'll have an understanding of where we're going and what the text says later on. It will give you a better context of what's happening. The words are going to pop up on the screen like they always will, and you'll find links to the text below. And I think it's time to dig in. So we're starting off with in Isaiah chapter 54, verse 1. Shout, O barren one who bore no child. Shout aloud for joy, you who did not travail. For the children of the wife forlorn shall outnumber those of the espoused, says the Lord. Is there a translation that starts to sing, O barren one?
Exactly. The word roni can mean to shout or sing in a joyful way. It's not shout in like a kind of way. It's give shout, to give a celebratory loud noise.
Which in the Torah would be very unlikely if you were barren, right? Having children was a huge blessing. So for you to sing and be barren is very unusual.
Exactly right. One of the things that's so important to understand when reading through the Haftarot is that the poetry and the metaphors that were used for 3,000 or 2,500 years ago are not always immediately accessible or understandable to the modern world. And certainly the feelings towards those that are having fertility problems in the modern world are very different, and thankfully we have many ways of helping. But in the ancient world, being barren wasn't just a question of I don't have kids or I don't feel like I fit into the society. Not having children meant I had no future. And I'm not talking next generation future. I'm talking about when I'm too old to work, who's going to take care of me? There was no systematic way of guaranteeing survivability in old age except through children. So having children was a very, very important thing. And since there might be more than one wife in some cases, a wife that had children and another wife who didn't have children, the wife without children, the barren one, much like Hannah in the story in Samuel, would feel very threatened for herself personally and for her personal future. And so the joy of a woman who had not had children now having children, it was one of the biggest metaphors you could use for unexpected bliss. And that's why it crops up poetically so often in the text.
Even we can start, I guess, Abraham is a great example of a story where they've gone nearly what would be for us a whole lifetime without children.
Absolutely, and all of the patriarchs had various issues when it came to having children or one wife or another having children, all the way through the first 3 generations of the patriarchs. And it became a very important motif that was used in that sense, and why it gets echoed in the biblical poetry as well. Of course, it's a very interesting counterpoint because a large chunk of the Torah portion of Noach is all about having kids. It's so-and-so begat so-and-so who begat so-and-so. So you have an endless cycle of children, and you have this whole image of the world being populated overabundantly at the beginning, in a sense of overabundantness of wickedness. And yet here, it's going from barrenness to fruitfulness, sort of the opposite direction.
Verse 2. Enlarge the site of your tent, extend the size of your dwelling, do not stint, lengthen the ropes, and drive the pegs firm. For you shall spread out to the right and the left, your offspring shall dispossess nations, and shall people desolate towns. We're clearly talking about extending the living arrangements for this people, right? I mean, obviously they were a tented community then; they understood what that meant. Today is a bit different.
Well, it'd be the equivalent of saying, if you're going to have a baby, you're going to need a bigger apartment. You're going to need the extra room, and so even before the baby's born, you're already looking for the new apartment. It's a sign of hope, of optimism for the future. And this prophecy of Isaiah was directed towards the Israelites that were in Babylon or who would just be coming back after the exile. And so giving them this sense of hope and optimism that although they're going to come back in joy, they would come back a bit weak and certainly a shadow of the former glory of Israel, but that little by little in the future they would continue to grow and blossom despite the hardships that they would be facing. And when it talks about, for example, peopling the desolate towns and dispossessing nations, that's really the imagery of what it was like for Israel to come back from Babylon after the 70 years of exile. That they came back and they found many of the towns were still abandoned, and they found many new people who had been moved there during the Babylonian occupation. That was part of the Babylonian strategy of mixing all the people up, and these people needed to make room for the returnees that were coming back to the land.
Fear not, you shall not be shamed. Do not cringe, you shall not be disgraced. For you shall forget the reproach of your youth, and remember no more the shame of your widowhood. For he who made you will espouse you. His name is Lord of hosts. The Holy One of Israel will redeem you. He is called the God of all earth. So here we've got another picture of kind of a marriage. This comes up a lot in the Tanakh, right?
Yes, it does. Marriage is one of the most common metaphors for our relationship with God, and the prophets use it consistently to explain partly why our betrayal of God during the idolatrous period was so severe, as it would be if a spouse were cheating on another, but also as a metaphor of redemption and restoration, that just as there might be a problem between husband and wife, that problem can be overcome, and the reconciliation can return them to a state of wedded bliss for the future.
The Lord has called you back as a wife, forlorn and forsaken. Can one cast off the wife of his youth, says your God? For a little while I forsook you, but with vast love I will bring you back. That's lovely, isn't it?
It's really a beautiful phrase, and something, again, that should speak to us relationally for our own lives. That no matter how rough certain relationships can be, if the love is there and the love is what built it in the first place, then it can always be repaired, it can always be restored. And that tenderness with which God is calling out to the people of Israel is so much more dominant than the reproach that sent us into exile.
Start again. 8. In slight anger for a moment I hid my face from you, but with kindness everlasting I will take you back in love, says the Lord your Redeemer, which reminds me a lot of Psalm 30, verse 5. His anger will only last for a moment. In the nighttime there is weeping, in the morning there is joy, something along those lines.
Exactly right, exactly right.
And here we have like a direct correlation, a direct kind of point to the Torah portion. For this to me is like the waters of Noah. As I swore that the waters of Noah never more would flood the earth, so I swear that I will not be angry with you or rebuke you. For the mountains may move, the hills may be shaken, but my loyalty shall never move from you, nor my covenant of friendship be shaken, says the Lord, who takes you back in love. It's great.
It's great, and as you say, it is a very clear parallel to the Torah portion. But uncovering that parallel or identifying it in some detail is a little bit trickier. Because what does it mean when it says that this to me is like the waters of Noah? That, okay, the flood will never come and I'll never be angry or rebuke you again, ever? That this will never happen again? That would seem to be questionable, given that many other prophetic works do talk about the failings of the people and that things need to be improved. So what exactly is being promised here? And one other thing I want to point out, although I do like the JPS translation in many places, sometimes there are pieces that can be lost when they smooth over the translation. If you look at the end of the verse 10 that you finished with just recently, it actually says Uvrit Shlomi, which they translate as the covenant of my covenant of friendship. But a translation that more people would be familiar with might be a covenant of my covenant of peace. And it's very easy to see why the JPS would translate it as covenant of friendship. Ma shlomech is how you ask, how are you doing? How's your peace going? It's a common expression of friendship and of familiarity. But in this particular case, I think that the idea of shlomi, of my peace, saying God, is a bit broader than that. It's not just a friendship. It's about a completion, of wholeness, and of the overriding perfection of what should be the relationship.
I've read when I read through it and I got to that part and it said this for me is like the waters of Noah. A couple of things sprung out. Immediately in the verse before, we have a flash, if you like, of anger, and I kind of paralleled that to the flash of the flood, and that this was kind of the peak of how bad it was ever going to get, and that anything after that would never reach that level again. And because of the promise he made, I'm not going to do this again. That doesn't mean he's not going to get angry, but he's never going to get that angry. That's how I read it.
And I think that's a very good interpretation of it, is that we see straight away after the story of Noah that God is still going to involve himself in the affairs of the world, and that there still will be actions that will be criticized, and when unfortunately necessary, there will still be actions that will be punished or stopped with aggressive means, to be diplomatic about it, from the story of the Tower of Babel to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and onward. But it would never be universal, it would never be wholesale ever again, and would be more specific and more targeted, and perhaps we might even argue with more restraint. One of the big lessons from the story of Noah is that God is trying to teach the people of Earth that God is not going to bring down the hammer instantly and universally every time there is a wholesale mess-up, but that instead God is going to restrain that sort of interaction. He will allow people to continue to exist with free will and make their own choices, good or bad, and will allow justice to take a much longer route to its conclusion. And that's not just a matter of building up our confidence that we have time and that God is at peace with us and that things will be okay. And it's certainly not to tell us, do whatever you want because God's not going to take any notice. It's trying to remind those that are trying hard, which we're going to see later when we talk about the Rosh Chodesh Haftarah, that even if you're trying hard and you don't feel like the world is being just, in the long run, justice will be served. And that God's patience in the meantime is meant to be taken as a blessing for everyone, not as a sign of weakness in the face of those that are transgressing.
Unhappy storm-tossed one, uncomforted, I will lay carbuncles on your building stones. I will make your foundations of sapphires. I will make your battlements of rubies, your gates of precious stones, your encycling wall of gems. So the big question, I think, for this whole Torah portion is, what is a carbuncle?
I love when I work with bar mitzvah students and we come to this line, and they always look at me and like, is that really what it says in the Hebrew? And really, it's talking about a precious stone, probably a garnet would be our normal word in modern English. It's a great time to point out that many of the translations that we have are not just a scholar's attempt to show his mastery of Hebrew, but it's also a scholar's attempt to show his mastery of English vocabulary, and choose often the biggest, most complicated word he can find, sometimes for the simplest of Hebrew words, to prove how erudite he is and his mastery of English, which is a shame, because the Hebrew was meant to be very, very close to everybody, to be written in the language of the common people, not just the language of the scholars or aristocracy. It's why Hebrew is just replete with such poetry that has metaphors and imagery that the average person, the average farmer, the average craftsman, as we're going to see, would be familiar with. You don't get so many metaphors or imagery taken from the life of only the rich or only of the kings. You get all the imagery taken from the life of the common people.
And so in this verse, we're looking at someone who needs to be, obviously, there's an unhappy, storm-tossed, uncomforted person here, and the words that follow are trying to make him feel more happy and less insecure and more comforted.
Exactly, and it's no matter how bad it seems at the moment, what's coming for you in the future is going to be beyond your wildest dreams.
And all your children shall be disciples of the Lord, and great shall be the happiness of your children. You shall be established through righteousness. You shall be safe from oppression. You shall have no fear from ruin, and it shall not come near you. So clearly we're looking at a position here where these people are, it says they're going to be established through righteousness. Where's that righteousness coming from?
Well, that's the great play on words here. So we have this verse 11, which talks about the building stones and the battlements and the gates and the walls, all of these constructive metaphors. And then in verse 13, we talk about the children being disciples and being established through righteousness and such. But there's a text that comes from the Talmud in Brachot, in Masechet Brachot, which actually makes a little bit of a pun to help us understand this. Because in verse 13 it says, V'chol banaich, and all your children. But you can read that not as banaich, which means your children, but bonaich, meaning your builders. And it makes a play on the idea that our children are our builders. And how does it happen that our children become the builders? Our children are the ones that are laying these foundation stones of precious stones, because they are limudei Adonai, because they are the disciples of God, because they are learners of God, that they are following in righteousness. And so you get that great transitive principle going, if A equals B and B equals C, if the building is going to be done in beauty, and the children are our builders, and they are building, and they are learning through God, then it becomes learning through God is the foundation stone for the world that we hope to see redeemed. And that process continues generation to generation by how we help our children learn more and more, so that they will lay the next layer of stone that will become what will provide us with safety, security, redemption, peace, and all the blessings that we are looking for.
We have this beginning part now where God's kind of putting his hands on the people too, and starting to protect them. Surely no harm can be done without my consent. Whoever would harm you shall fail because of you, it says. It is I who created the smith to fan the charcoal fire, to produce the tools for his work. So it is I who create the instruments of havoc. I've seen instruments, a destroyer of waste and all kinds of things in for that line. No weapon formed against you shall succeed, and every tongue that contends with you at law you shall defeat. Such is the lot of the servants of the Lord, such their triumph through me, declares the Lord. That's quite a good lot to have if you were going to pick one.
Yes, and it's a very powerful imagery. It's trying to remind everyone that the sword isn't made by the smith. The sword is ultimately made through the structure, the flow of the universe, that God is the ultimate creator. And therefore, if God decides that there will be a time when war won't work, then war won't work. And the instruments of war will lose their ability. That we should recognize that ultimately they are in the hands of God, not the hands of those that wield them. And although we may constantly be frustrated by the free choice that God gave us, and that many people use to wield weapons of war against each other, if the people were to recognize God and were to live according to the proper flow of the world, the weapons would no longer be weapons, and they would no longer be used as such. And ultimately they would become powerless in the world.
So we're ticking over into chapter 55. This is it kind of changes tack a little bit here, I think. Ho! That's right. All who are thirsty, come for water. Even if you have no money, come, buy food and eat. Buy food without money, wine and milk without cost. I think I might read through the whole thing, and then we can go back into and start from the beginning when we talk about it. 2. Why do you spend money for what is not bread, your earnings for what does not satisfy? Give heed to me, and you shall eat choice food and enjoy the richest viands. Incline your ear and come to me, hearken, and you shall be received, and I will make with you an everlasting covenant, the enduring loyalty promised to David, as I made him a leader of peoples, a prince and a commander of peoples. So you shall summon a nation you did not know, and a nation that you did not know shall come running to you for the sake of the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, who has glorified you. Right. So from 1, we get this kind of picture of being fed, but this is a spiritual food, isn't it? They're talking about the Word of God and the Torah, and people who maybe up to this point have kind of spiritually maybe a little bit bankrupt.
The metaphor of coming for water and coming for food, and the idea that the spirituality that God is offering is free, and yet the idolatry and other things that people are doing, that they are spending money on things. They may think they're buying spirituality by buying their idols, by doing their idolatrous practices, but that doesn't actually feed you. You're spending money for something that isn't bread. Idolatry costs a lot and gives you nothing, whereas God costs nothing and gives you everything. And so the prophet Isaiah is really just sort of scratching his head saying, don't you see this? That you're wasting your time, your money on something that gives you nothing when everything that you need is free and already been given. There is one connection here, though, that I think we would be remiss if we didn't point out to the Torah portion of Noah, which is come for water. After all the water of Noah, our sages, tried to point out to us, how dare Isaiah talk about water in a positive light in the Haftarah for Noach. But there's a very good reason for that. There's this notion that too much water can be destructive, but not enough water is equally destructive. And that what many people might have done would have been to recoil from God because of the destruction of Noah. And I know that, to this day there are many people who say, I refuse to believe in any God that would drown the world. And therefore they turn their back. And this is trying to say, no, there's another side to the water, to the spring that comes forth from God. And this is what is ultimately sustaining. This is ultimately what our spirit and our bodies need. And it comes from that same source. And yes, it can be difficult to understand completely the lesson that the story of Noah is giving. And it can seem very jarring. But ultimately, the only reason that the story of Noah seems jarring and seems unfair is because we have learned the rest of the lessons that have flown from God's spring, about what is fair and what is unfair. And that's why we are in a position to even begin to think of perhaps criticizing, because we now know that we would not carry out justice in what it seems like it was like during the time of Noah. But that comes from the same source. The water is flowing from the same spring.
Two other things I think we need to jump on before we finish. The first part is the inclusion of the promise of loyalty that was made to David.
Mm-hmm.
Are we specifically, is the verse specifically talking about bringing the line of David back, or is there something else going on?
Yes.
Great.
It's speaking specifically about the line of David in terms of the line of the Mashiach, who is coming from the line of David. But it's also talking about, when it talks about the promise to David, it's talking about Jewish independence. David symbolizes not just the messianic redemption, but it also symbolizes Jewish independence and not being under foreign oppression and occupation. And this would have been a coded promise to the people who lived under the Persian Empire, that even though things were good, a lot better than the Babylonians, a lot better than the Assyrians, we still were not 100% independent. We could do pretty much what we wanted within the borders of our own domain, but that domain was established by the Persians. And our taxes were set by the Persians. And our foreign policy was set by the Persians. And we certainly didn't have an independent way of defending ourselves against any outsiders. That was the Persians. So talking about David would have been a subtle way to say, and one day we'll be free of the Persians too. That no matter how nice they are as despots go, we're still not independent, and eventually we will be free. But you don't want to say that too loud or too clearly, because the Persians don't like hearing that sort of thing, and that would be a good way to get them angry. Similarly, in later rabbinic literature under Roman occupation and oppression, or then later in times during Christian Europe or the Muslim Middle East, when Jews faced stiff oppression from those lands, they would also talk about redemption and Jewish independence in ways that would not cause undue retaliation by the ruling authorities of the time. And so certain code words and code phrases were a wink and a nod to our hope, with hopefully not causing too much retaliation at the present.
And part of that would be this Haftarah portion, perhaps.
Absolutely. All of the Haftarot would have seemed to most of the outsiders as perfectly innocuous and just very general praise and thanksgiving or promises. But for many of us, it was part of what kept us alive and kept our spirit up, that eventually the hope we had was not a mythical hope, but there would be a real reestablishment of Jewish independence and freedom, and a real establishment of a better world. It wasn't just a passing vision.
The last thing would be the verse that says, "So you shall summon a nation you did not know, and a nation that did not know you shall come running to you." Which nation?
Yeah, good question. It depends on where you're trying to place this historically. If you're trying to place the prophecy as being aimed primarily at the people in Babylonian captivity, then the nation that's being talked about here would probably be the Persian Empire. That to the Jews who were in Babylon under the captivity, the idea that there would be another nation that would come that we didn't know and that had no connection to us, and yet they would bring us freedom. They would allow us to reestablish our presence in the land of Israel, would seem pretty miraculous and an amazing fulfillment. On the other hand, this might be talking about something that hasn't happened yet. That this is something that will come in the future as a redemptive promise. That although it may seem at different points in our history that every nation has been against us, that's not the case. That there are other good people, there are other good nations out there that will support and that will work with us for the establishment of a good and just world. And certainly I think that you could read it as being both. That both in the past we had unexpected help and assistance from an empire that behaved differently than the previous empires that had been bothering us, but so too in the future. We shouldn't look with only suspicion at other nations, but should recognize that all the nations of the world have the potential to come running towards goodness and justice, and many of them have already been on that path now for quite a long time, which is why, despite the current problems in the world is still better off now than it was 500 years ago. More people live in freedom, more people live being able to follow Torah, more people live being able to find their path towards God than ever before. And we shouldn't be ungrateful for that progress.
Well, you know what, that brings us to the end. Thank you for joining us again this week, Rabbi Neely.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Looking forward to the next one.
And thank you, viewers, for coming and spending some time with us. At the end of the show, we'll show you what next week's Torah portion is and the verses. Would like your comments on what we've talked about below. If you've got questions you'd like us to bring up in a later episode, please leave them below. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share this video. Share the heck out of this video. And we'll see you all again next week. Bye-bye.